Well, as completely expected, Xi Jinping got a unanimous support of just under 3,000 delegates. They include pretty much all of China's top leaders. Not a single dissenting vote for him to become the president for a third term, which you might remember this was a big deal several years ago when he put it out there publicly that he was going to end term limits for the presidency. Also to Han Zheng, who's in the top cabinet, or was in the top cabinet. He is the vice president. But look, these state titles are not very important. In October last year, the Communist Party held a once every 5-year Congress. That's what really counts. That's where Xi Jinping was confirmed for at least another 5 years as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. That is the most important title in China. The second most important is head of the Central Military Commission, which he also is doing for another 5 years at least. So the presidency is just kind of like the third most important title, really. It didn't used to be that important, but in a way, he has kind of elevated it because the days of the head of the Communist Party being someone different to the nominal president of the state, those days are pretty much over, and obviously China has a much bigger role on the world stage now than it did 20, 30 years ago. So I think the idea that Xi Jinping would continue to swan around Europe and places like that with a title of General Secretary of the Communist Party, I think he himself probably thinks president goes down a bit better when dealing with other countries.
Well, he has faced challenges in recent months, including dealing with mass protests over his zero COVID policy, slowing economic growth. But those issues weren't really brought up at this week's NPC.
Yeah, because the NPC is not a real parliament. It's a rubber stamp gathering of people who are officially putting into law legislation that was worked out behind closed doors by the Communist Party previously. The personnel changes, Xi Jinping being confirmed for president, this wasn't to be debated or anything at the Congress. There are no opposition parties in China. There are sort of 7 or 8 fake opposition parties that are all under the leadership of the Communist Party. I mean, the whole thing is just not a parliament in the way that we would conceive of one. So no surprises, although in the past you did have at times somewhat contentious proposals put forth that received dissenting votes. I'm talking about the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era. Things like policies involving, dams in the Yangtze basin and trying to do major projects like that. You did actually have pushback. Usually it was very rare to see a bill go down, but you did have pushback occasionally. These days, certainly on anything particularly politically important, like Xi Jinping's power being extended, not a single dissenting voice at all. So you were asking about, the COVID zero policy, that failed. The sort of sluggish economy, although we do see that it's kind of picking up a bit now. Would you expect in a forum like this that you'd have debate and people dwelling on it? Not at all.
Fascinating nonetheless. What do you think his overall vision for China is, and how would you assess where he's at in achieving all of that?
Well, I think Xi Jinping's pretty focused on rivalry with the United States. We saw that with this economic growth target of 5% GDP expansion. That was kind of modest compared to what people expected. It's also kind of realistic, though. So the Chinese authorities, you'd think, would be able to achieve that in the coming 12 months because they're going off such a low base. But, the old days of growth at all costs are well and truly over. And where the Chinese government was opening the purse strings and spending money was in things like technological funding for semiconductor development, or a 7.2% increase in the official military budget for this year. Things like that. They're all very strategic. They're all very goal-orientated. So I think now that he's absolutely secured another 5 years at least in power, these long-term goals to try and wean China off technology dependence of other countries, to eventually take over Taiwan in one way or another. I think Xi Jinping likely sees himself as the man of history who is either going to achieve these things or at least put China on a path towards achieving them.
And as you say, Bill, this week has been a week of confirming positions. Tomorrow, Li Qiang is expected to be confirmed as Premier. We know that he's closer to Xi Jinping than outgoing Premier Li Qiang ever was, as we understand it. Tell us more about that and what else we know about him.
Well, Li Qiang's a bloke who worked with Xi Jinping quite closely at the provincial level over the years. In more recent years, he was put in charge of Shanghai. He's very much seen as somebody whose career has closely followed Xi Jinping, and that's why he is presumed to be a Xi loyalist, and that's why he got the job as the deputy leader of the Communist Party. But the big shift that Xi Jinping has made in the past 10 years is transforming that top cabinet. It's currently a 7-man body. Previously it was a 9-man body, but it's always pretty small. And once upon a time it used to sort of be this power-sharing body, particularly in the previous administration where Hu Jintao and the Premier Wen Jiabao kind of jointly ran the show, whereas what Xi Jinping appears to have done is he shifted it into more of a board of directors. He's the CEO, he's the chairman, he's in charge, and these guys in his top cabinet, including the number 2 Li Qiang, appear to be tasked now with carrying out his orders or his policies, rather than sitting there behind closed doors debating them and kind of, sharing power equally. This is all very opaque. It's an outside perspective. Nobody knows for sure, but expectations are not particularly high, Yvonne, that Li Qiang is going to cut much of his own figure in the next few years, but rather be the sort of guy who carries out Xi Jinping's agenda.